Better. Not in the special yes, I do. Yeah, I'm fine. They say to not say I'm Which is different. I mean, it's not my first rodeo. Well, kind of expecting it to happen because when I went in for my pancreatitis in January, they did a CT scan and that popped up. I was just sitting in my right kidney, who wasn't moving or anything. And so I'm not surprised.
Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Let's go ahead and get started. So we are in the third week of the term, wrapping things up, and we have one more theory to talk about for this week, the agenda setting theory. As a reminder, by this Sunday, your annotated bibliography is due as a submission to Canvas. Remember that needs to include at least 3 outside sources. I can still look at rough drafts or outlines as long as they're sent by the end of the day today. If you need kind of like emergency or last minute help on that assignment, let me know and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Again, I recommend looking through the rubric of that assignment and using the rubric to work backwards in order to complete and catch up on the material there. So just know that that's coming up. And then last class, we talked about, and I shared the schedule for your theory presentations. So our first presentation will be next Monday from Riley. And then we also talked about social information processing theory and use of examples and applications, looking at the impact and power of online communication to essentially create close relationships through the use of online games like Second Life, Club Penguin, etc. So we talked about how that can be used in our interpersonal relationships. And one step that we talked about as we manage catfishing or inaccurate information we receive online is blank. First, to the perceived legitimacy of information we get online. What is that blank? See who's the first to grab it. Warranting? Yes, thanks, Gavin. So warranting, right, is a way that we try to prove the information that we receive online. For instance, maybe somebody has talked about how they're a software engineer, and we try to look up their first and last name and find they are one on LinkedIn. Great. We are more likely to trust them on that basis. As a reminder, the presentation schedule was shared in class on Wednesday and also posted to Canvas. I did my best to respect your first or second choice. And there are a couple classes where we have multiple people signed up. We'll just go back to back. But you'll still be working alone on your presentation. And then remember that the rubric, including the outline that I'm asking you to turn in advance, are listed there on Canvas. We'll give you the 46 minutes when you're scheduled to present, and we'll hear from you and move on from there. So we'll have Riley, Presley, and Angela who will be starting us next week. Any questions about the presentation schedule or about the annotated bibliography at this stage? Okay. Great. So for today, our last theory of the week is agenda setting theory. And this week we'll be shifting gears a little bit to talk a little bit more about mediated theories, right? Moving on from a face-to-face interaction, personal communication, to more about how we use media to communicate. So media might include the use of social media, such as electronics. It might include the use of mass media, such as television, and similar ways to use apps like YouTube. So it's about reaching a wider audience and about how we engage in communication strategies with that in mind. Dr. Jiawei Chen does a lot of work in media studies and media ethics. There's somebody to take a course with if you haven't already, if you're interested in exploring those areas further. So we'll look at agenda setting theory and some of its applications to our own life. So what I want you to do to start things out is if you have a laptop, smartphone, or other device with you, I just want you to take a couple minutes to check some of the major news headlines that you're noticing that stand out. You can use whatever outlets you normally use to check the news, but if you haven't already checked or you don't regularly check, You might consider using Google or Apple News, BBC, or other sites that are used to check the news. And then I want you to take note about some of the major headlines or topics that you're noticing. Not just in terms of what the topic itself is, but also how the headlines or articles that you're noticing talk about that topic. If you don't have a device with you, I encourage you to find a partner or group of 3 to work with so that you could maybe share or search some headlines together. So take some time to look at that a little bit and be prepared to report on some of the headlines or major things that you're noticing. So as you're finding some of these headlines, go ahead and when you have one, like a major headline that you're noticing, go ahead and share that with us. What is a headline that is coming up? Okay, what about it specifically? How is it being phrased in a headline?
There's just a bunch of live updates.
Cool.
I guess you could say like look at the war crimes. I
Okay.
saw a lot of articles about Putin's war crimes.
Okay.
I saw a lot of
Okay. Okay. So continue to look for another minute or two. Okay, so there are articles about Russia and Ukraine. What else is being talked about, like in terms of headlines? What are some of the subjects or titles of articles you're seeing? Yeah.
I had New York City subway shooting suspect hit Catskill during that.
Okay.
South Carolina death row prisoner choosing a firing squad over the electric chair.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Biden's coming to Portland so that he can try and garner support for his infrastructure bill.
Okay.
That was my beloved side family of Patrick. How do you say that last name? Curious. Say police killed their son in an accident.
Okay.
I found one that's on the same story. And they said my son was killed looking at me.
Twitter board passes poison pill to stop us.
Okay.
The New York Times, Jerusalem calls after Israeli-Palestinian clashes at the site.
Could you repeat that first part again?
So it's from the New York Times, Jerusalem calls after Israeli-Palestinian clashes at the site.
Gavin and Daniel.
Frustration and anger when Shanghai residents as China doubles down on zero COVID policy.
Okay. Yeah. Dan.
Senator Dianne Feinstein pushes back against the fourth and 13th.
Okay. All right. I think this is a good starting point, unless there's any others that are standing out to people. Oh yeah, what's your LeGrand update?
Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco Vice President to visit with
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, that we're having an event on that on our campus where he's coming to share a little bit.
All the economics.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. It's cool that we're getting that speaker. I think there were a few speakers announced that were coming to campus yesterday at an EOU update. So I wanted to share and have us start to work on this together for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, one of the things that I'm noticing in headlines and articles that you all are pointing out is topic, right? Obviously, Russia, Ukraine is being talked about a lot. It was probably one of the first results that you saw. We also are seeing discussion as it was related to this case surrounding a civilian who was killed, discussion surrounding Israeli-Palestinian conflict, COVID-19, and its policy internationally, and other topics maybe related to elected officials in terms of their qualifications or behavior or travel, right? And also some local news. There's a good chance that algorithmically, if you did like a Google News search, that they had an algorithm that showed your location or area. But I used quotations here because I was really interested in how some of these headlines were phrasing these topics. For instance, this phrasing of war crimes, right, brings in a politically and socially charged perspective, a manhunt, right, to target and identify the shooting suspect. The two kind of different frames that were used to describe the person that was killed in that story. The use of the term poison pill to describe Twitter's actions to try to prevent Musk's purchase of Twitter, right? The usage of calm, clashes, frustration, anger, mentally unfit. The language choices that are being used, right, in these headlines and news articles are in many ways dictating how we're understanding and making sense of the content here, right? That when we are receiving news, regardless of the source, when we're thinking about bias or role, that the headline is in many ways telling us how we're supposed to interpret or make sense of that information, right? That we're expected to see calm in an area that has experienced significant international strife. We're expected to identify sort of like at a personal level with an individual who was killed, right? The language that's used here and the ways that it's phrased is important in a very similar way to the content that is appearing to, right? I've heard a couple of people mention that they're not a fan of checking the news because sometimes it can be depressing or not the most fun to read through, and I can understand that. However, I think that as we're checking the headlines, right, and our frustration with what might be listed there and what we pay attention to on the headlines, that tells us a lot about what types of stories or issues are kind of put at the top of the docket or seem to garner the most attention. And this idea of tracking content that's posted in headlines and material is in many ways guiding how we understand agenda setting theory. So agenda setting theory, right, is a mediated theory, and it's suggesting that media is setting the agenda for the public. Media is actually a plural word. So we would say media tells us. A little bit of a pet peeve of mine is when the media is used. So it's sort of like saying the books, if you were trying to refer to books as singular, right? So media set the agenda for the public. That when you all check those headlines and noted some of the major articles that came up from those sources, that those are what are considered to be the most important headlines or topics for us to talk about or us to think about. If you're talking to friends about current events, if you're sitting at the table with family discussing social events or issues, or you're just getting your weekly Apple News alert where they have some headlines and other information, or we see what's trending on social media, there's a good chance that agenda setting theory is at play there, right? Media tells us what is important or what we should pay attention to in terms of news, current events, and other issues by a couple things. First of all, by the number of times something is reported. The more that we see a particular topic or story being picked up on and shared by multiple news outlets, the more we come to view that issue as important. Especially when we think about things such as political bias or slant of news sources, right? We know that some topics are going to be talked about a lot more or less depending on the political orientation or views of that news source. But oftentimes, if we know that regardless of the source, this topic or issue is coming up and being talked about, we tend to perceive that as more important, right? We also know that if something is not reported or not talked about or not picked up on in the same way, we tend to associate that story with being less important, right? So we look to the frequency with which something is reported to determine its significance. Russia, Ukraine has been a lot on the mind because it's been posted and talked about everywhere, and therefore we perceive it as an important topic. So agenda setting theory, again, comes from a socio-psychological perspective, right? Trying to understand our human relationships and cognition. But as mentioned, it comes from a mass media perspective. Mass media, you could think about as media that is designed for a larger public or audience, right? It is circulated or disseminated to a larger group. And that could be, something like a news article or viral video or photo. We'll talk about, I think, an interesting and pretty clear example that's fun to talk about with agenda setting at play, which was happened a little over a decade ago, the Balloon Boy hoax, which is an example of some of the problems that we see with agenda setting theory. So agenda setting theory brings in some key assumptions, right? That is that media have the ability to establish an agenda right? Or a set of topics or issues that receive focus and attention. And in this way, right, the issues and headlines that media have chosen to focus on are not necessarily reflecting reality. It's not that these are the most important issues, and therefore they are reflected in headlines, but instead, media have the ability to shape and filter reality for the public. We noticed that in some of the phrasing that came in the headlines that you all pointed out. Frustration and anger over China's COVID-19 policy. The idea of calming as it related to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? The way in which that's portrayed, filtered, and represented through headlines and articles is a major part of this theory. News, including current events, play a major role in shaping our social and political reality. We not only learn about the topics or issues, but also about how important and relevant they are. Again, when we look at what are the top stories, what gains the most attention or focus, that is agenda setting theory. The degree of discussion and sort of analysis and takes on the Academy Awards on the interaction between Will Smith and Chris Rock is an example, right, of how relevance of topics or issues is portrayed through media. Media has the ability to set the agenda in relationship to a lot of different factors. One of them is media credibility. Credibility being how much do we trust the source? And again, we can think about things such as social or political bias. You can also think about whether or not that source has reliably shared accurate information. If you're in the checkout line at Safeway and you see like the National Enquirer that has a really bizarre and out there story about somebody dating Bigfoot, there's a good chance that we're not likely seeing that as credible. The extent of conflicting evidence, that is, we see evidence that goes against what is being portrayed or talked about, again, can be an issue of credibility. Shared values, again, we oftentimes seek out media sources that reinforce or support our views on particular topics, or algorithms that we receive through social media and through doing something like a Google News search are based on the topics and activity that we like. Actually, on social media, including Facebook, they will modify what articles show up for you, like as advertisements, based on what they believe are your interests or your demographics, right? And another idea here is an audience need for guidance. There are some articles and sources that largely speak for themselves. That is, that the information is informative, but there are also topics or issues that are highly opinionated, right? If we're talking, for instance, about infrastructure legislation in the United States, while we could receive factual information and a bill, right, there are a lot of conflicting perspectives on whether or not that would be a good policy. So those are some key ideas here on agenda setting theory. This theory comes from Matthew McCombs and Donald Shaw, who are both professors studying issues related to journalism, ethics, and media, and the ways in which media can impact our understanding of issues. I think one really good way to think about media and media's relationship to society in a historical context is to think about a world before the internet, before social media, and to think about where people got news, right? Obviously, it wasn't through carrier pigeon, but prior in this stage of the Industrial Revolution, when we had access to the printing press and we had the wider circulation of news and current events, right? There was a lot of power that media had to, in many ways, have us talking about and thinking about these current events and issues. For instance, if you have seen like a period piece, or you think back historically, there is this sort of trope of like a paper boy or a paper person, right, or child who like says extra, extra, and is holding up a newspaper that has the headlines of the day, right? Or you watch film or shows set in the past, and they do the thing where there's like a spinning newspaper that has a big headline on it, right? The large text used to tell us an update or issue. In this situation, right, the Titanic sinking might be one example, is how media operated in the past. That media, in many ways, through newspaper, was able to circulate and share the most important issues. That journalists were able to tell us what was important and what was the major topic of discussion. In this way, this is this idea of media gatekeeping. That members of newspapers, right, and publishing companies were able to surveil and understand and track current events to determine what was relevant and establish like a correlation of what is relevant to what they covered. Or historically, people such as journalists were able to contact political leaders, policymakers, and individuals who were addressing or dealing with some major current events, and therefore allowed those articles or those newspaper outlets to post articles on those issues, right? We think about, for instance, the New Deal or investment in Medicare or Medicaid, like those types of topics were discussed in policy and therefore were represented in news articles and headlines. The idea here, thinking historically about the use of the printing press and newspaper as a source of news, was that media played a significant role in our public agendas and issues that we considered important to ourselves. That's not to say that personally in our own lives we can deal with our own set of issues or topics that we saw as the most important to our lives, but instead to say that when we received media sources such as the newspaper that had a lot of power to help us determine what was important, especially when we didn't have access to the internet, right? So pictured here on the right is Terri Schiavo. Is there anybody who's familiar with this case? Heard this term used before? So this was an example of a prominent news story that came up during the George W. Bush administration. This was a case in which there was a woman who was in what was considered to be a largely vegetative state. And there was a significant sort of policy and ethical question related to Terri Schiavo's family and whether or not she, the IVs and support that she was receiving in that state should be removed, if they should pull the plug or not, right? And while that was an individual or family level issue, it became a significant national, social, and political discussion, even implicating the president, right? Because it was widely picked up on, circulated, and discussed in the media. We can think about a lot of other examples or cases in which there is a single story, right, that in many ways gets picked up on and discussed to such an extent, maybe because it's important, it's considered sensationalist or surprising or interesting, right? It gains a lot of attention. And that's, again, agenda setting theory in action. Agenda setting theory has three stages. The first is that media has power to define issues that are important. They say, okay, issues related to war in Russia and Ukraine, issues related to Biden's infrastructure policy and travel, issues related to China and China's COVID-19 policy are things we deem important and therefore are things that we will post and share about in our articles and discussion, right? That's the first step. The second step then is that we as people, we as consumers, therefore incorporate or talk about or think about those issues in our lives and what we seem to care about, right? There's a good chance if you talk to older relatives that most often the topics or issues that they see as important socially and politically are the things that they might see from watching TV, right? Or checking the headlines or news themselves. That when they want to talk about current events, they're using that to guide them. And then the last discussion or issue is the idea that policymakers incorporate the concerns that public has, the discussion or issues that public has related to this topic that's been discussed and circulated in media, and therefore incorporate those concerns or issues into policy. There's a lot of ways that this happens. One of them is the idea of like a town hall, right, or an event in which a policymaker visits a large group of the public and addresses or talks about issues with that public. Other ways that this happens include things such as the use of protest, right? The use of and circulation of information to particular political candidates, and so on. When we had this most recent Supreme Court confirmation, right, the candidates who in many ways were kind of right in the middle, for instance, Senator Joe Manchin, Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski were ones that gained a lot of feedback and attention from people in regards to what they thought of the candidate and whether or not that senator should support the nomination, right? Those are examples of how policymakers are then put in a position based on the discussion that we have surrounding these issues that can pressure or influence decisions. Obviously, there are ways that that doesn't necessarily play out in either direction. There are a lot of questions that come up related to terms or relative power that a policymaker has, their ability to influence decisions and so on. But particularly when policymakers worry about things such as re-election and polling, they are likely to incorporate how their demographic or constituents are responding to or talking about issues that media has discussed and made important for the discussion. So in this way, right, there are sort of three different components to how agenda setting theory works. When we're talking about agenda, we're talking about the important issues. See, I do that too. I say the media sometimes just because it's used so often, right? Agenda refers to how media has power to define and decide on the issues that we consider to be important. Attribution is an important component here. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. The language and phrasing that you all saw, this idea of frustration, concern, calling, right, are identifying the parts of the topic that we should care about or focus on. Has anybody heard of the pyramid in regards to journalism or news articles? So the pyramid is the idea that news articles generally, if you're reading like a current events piece, if you have an update about Russia and Ukraine, generally they will put the most important information in the first paragraph or first part of the article. The idea being that in order to best use your time, the most important stuff comes first. And therefore, the more you read, the less directly relevant or significant the information is. Sometimes you'll get in more background information or context, but that format is designed to help us focus on the biggest parts of the issue at the very top, right? So attribution, deciding what goes at the top of the article, is an example of agenda setting. And then there's also this idea of network agenda setting, right? This idea of how we think about or discuss the topic as well, right? So we see this a lot in discussions about sort of culture, identity, and related issues and the social and political connotations that those bring as well. There's a few other ideas here that I think are useful as we're thinking about and developing, this theory that we can explore a little bit more. So one of them is this idea of media framing. Again, it's not just what you say, but it's also a question of how media depict or talk about a particular issue. So media framing is a question of how this depiction, like you're taking a photo and you choose, what angle you're using for the photo, what is or isn't included, what filter you're using, and so on, dictate how we perceive or talk about the issue, right? So again, do we talk about frustration or anger related to a COVID-19 policy? Do we talk about safety? Do we talk about issues of freedom? Do we talk about issues of access? What is being talked about in this article? So that's the idea of framing, how something is talked about or depicted. If we think about examples of iconic imagery, right, or photography that has really stood out to us, including the use more contemporarily of memes, right? Examples such as the Iwo Jima photo, right, of soldiers who are propping up the American flag, or the Tiananmen Man, right, the picture of the protester who's an average man that's standing in front of a tank, right, at Tiananmen Square are examples of how we use framing to depict or represent major issues. The idea of priming is important too. How media presents or thinks about an issue now is important to how we think about or talk about an issue in the future. We think about a lot of politically and socially charged issues, right? For instance, we think about the topic of abortion, right? There's a good chance that how we think about this topic and debate and discussion surrounding that topic has been impacted and influenced by how this topic has been discussed and represented in the past. Salience refers to the idea of a topic being important relative to other topics, right? That when a topic is more salient, again, such as war in Russia and Ukraine, that could be an example of it being seen as more important. In tracking trends over time, it's been interesting to note that coverage of Russia and Ukraine has gone up significantly, while coverage of COVID-19 has gone down. That's an example of the salience of these two topics changing. Relevance is an issue of whether or not we view these topics or issues being discussed as personally important to us. So for some of us who don't regularly check the news or current events, we might do so because we don't necessarily perceive these topics or issues as directly relevant to our lives. Or maybe we're more inclined to check local news and hear about like EOU updates, like people coming to campus and so on, right? Whether or not we care and see it as personally relevant is important. Uncertainty refers to the degree of information that we have about a given topic, right? If you are seeing another article about a topic that you already understand and have seen discussed elsewhere pretty well, there's a good chance you probably won't read past the headline, right? But if you don't know the topic, like there is a new development, for instance, there was the sinking of the Russian ship that happened the other day, you might want to learn more about that issue. We'll talk later in the course about uses in gratification theory. But this is another useful way to think about agenda setting theory. It's the idea that we as consumers and people are actively seeking out media that fulfills our own needs. So in this way, we are looking at news articles, we're looking at websites and so on that represent or support the goals that we're trying to figure out. For instance, when I was on the debate team, we had to check the news all the time because we were constantly debating and talking about current events. So we're actively using media that aligns with the issues that we care about. Additionally, another important idea here is this idea of power relations. So one way to think about this is what is the voice or level of power that the source has versus the level of power or information that media has, right? So if we think, for instance, about the idea of a high power source, it's the idea that the source or topic or issue itself carries a lot of voice and carries a lot of weight on its own, right? The idea, for instance, that a Russian ship has been sunk by Ukrainian forces is a high power source. But that information carries a lot of weight and carries a lot of significance, right? The level of power in terms of influence, support, attention that a media source receives is also going to be really important. If a source is seen as credible and has a lot of influence, its ability to sway or depict the issue is going to be really important. So in this context, with a high power source and high power media, we see that an issue is important, but it's also talked about by an important outlet. It's likely to be salient and likely to be important. If we see, for example, breaking news, and at the top of Google News, we see a major update, we're likely to see both the source and the topic is important. If the source is important, but the media, the actual power of media is low, oftentimes the source itself is driving the discussion in a factual way. If you see an article that comes out from a source you've never heard of that's talking about the sinking of the Russian ship, it's likely to be information, right? You're likely not to receive much information or credibility from the source itself, from the media source, but from the actual article or issue. Low power source and high power media would mean a topic or issue that is open and very malleable, right? It might be, especially in the context of social and cultural issues, an area in which media has a lot of power to dictate how we should think about or approach that issue. And we also have articles or issues that don't circulate very well, right? Low power source and low power media. And again, the power of the source sort of impacts what level of voice that source has. Power of media is the level of credibility, attention, or influence that source has in sharing that information. So I want you to take some time on your own to think about, in relationship to the news headlines that you all noticed, how you would categorize some of the headlines that you noticed. So for instance, which of those 4 quadrants would you put them in? High power source, high power media, high power source, low power media, and so on. And then we talked about framing, right? How an issue is discussed or depicted by that source. What are you noticing regarding framing here? How are the articles that you found framed? Take a little bit of time to talk about this. Go ahead and wrap up your observations here. So as we're thinking about this, right, about the way in which media can frame or discuss an issue, Another important idea is this idea that there's sort of what's known as pack journalism or groupthink. You can think about this as kind of like dominoes or like blendings off a cliff. The idea that one media source is talking about or depicting an issue, and as a result, multiple outlets pick up on the story. They kind of dogpile on that issue because they see that other sources are talking about that too. That's another example of the way that salience and significance can develop. Who starts it versus how it continues. There are some critiques of this theory. One of them being a question as to whether or not there even is a public agenda anymore because of the way that political polarization and so on exists. The headlines that you're going to get on MSNBC are very different than the ones you get on Fox News, right? The idea being that political slant or bias in many ways implicates what agenda we might consider to be important. It, in many ways, leads us to having very different languages or sets of issues we deem important. Another critique is the idea that agenda setting theory could be too broad, that there could be different agendas that sources receive. And also the idea that through the use of internet, multimedia, through information circulating, going viral, and also algorithms and our own interests dictating issues, that we might have a lot more power than before to decide and dictate agenda too. That oftentimes it's because of hits, traffic, headlines, what we oftentimes see as kind of clickbait articles that are the ones that gain a lot more attention relative to the past. So to wrap up for today, I want to show a short video clip from a 2009 incident called the Balloon Boy hoax that I think shows us some of the issues related to agenda setting at play. So I'll share the clip here about this issue.
This is the first time I've ever seen anything like this myself.
The video was dramatic.
Going at about 8 knots,
The story incredible.
he may get smacked into power lines.
A little boy caught in a runaway balloon.
He just touched the ground.
Even when it turned out Falcon Heaney was never airborne and was hiding at home all that time,
I'm planning to find soccer.
sheriffs were more relieved than skeptical.
We believe at this time that it's a real event.
Falcon's dad, Richard, did indeed demonstrate emotion in this home video of the balloon coming loose. The question is, was it real or playing to the camera? The unraveling of the hoax came during an unscripted moment. In a live television interview, Falcon was asked why he hid when everyone was searching for him.
We did this for a show.
It became very clear to us at that point that they were lying. He picked up on it, we picked up on it.
Getting a TV show for his family has been Richard Heaney's goal.
No, am I not like crazy?
They appeared on the reality show Wife Swap, and he wanted more. The former research assistant told the website Gawker it was all Richard thought about.
It was really about, hey, if we did this right, it'd be on every major news network around the world.
Last night, police seized evidence from the Heaney home. And of the 4 charges the department hopes to file over the next few days, 2 are class 4 felonies, which carry up to 6 years of jail time and $500,000 in fines. Today, the sheriff said the Heaneys met in Hollywood acting school. Their emotions over the last few days were just an act.
So needless to say, they put on a very good show for us, and we bought it.
Officials are also considering fining the Heaneys for the tens of thousands of dollars it costs to pursue the runaway balloon. And the FAA may fine them because it invaded restricted airspace near Denver International Airport. It could all add up to more of a financial reality than Mr. Heaney expected. Russ?
Patty Coffin in Fort Collins, Colorado. Thank you very much.
So this was a bit of a wild story when this happened in 2009. But the interesting thing about this, right, was this idea that it was picked up on by pretty much every major news outlet. You could probably imagine from Fort Collins, Denver, there was a live footage of like NBC, CNN, all of the news outlets like watching this balloon go by because they were really freaked out that there was a kid inside that balloon the whole time. Turned out not to be the case, right? The sort of example of pack journalism, a groupthink of the amount of attention that what ended up being a hoax received is an example of agenda setting theory at play, right? At the time, this gained so much attention and traction and influence that we were told, oh no, there's this little kid trapped in a balloon, and it became this sort of top story for a period of time, right? Kind of showing us how agenda setting theory and defining issues plays a major role even if the topic or issue does not turn out to be significant at all, and is a little boy who's, you know, hiding the whole time and saying in an interview that he lied about it for the show, right? So an example here of the challenges of agenda setting. So to wrap up for today, talk about agenda setting theory, the power of media to assign significance to current events, its way in thinking about how topics are framed or discussed, but also how in the context of social media and the changes that we have seen and how we receive, use, and take in current events and news, that maybe this theory has some issues or pushback, right? It's not necessarily relevant to us in the same way when we think about how we have maybe more power to define and use media on our own terms. Next Sunday, Riley will do our first presentation of the class, and we will move on to spiral of silence theory. So go ahead and email or pass forward your attendance activities for today. Have a great weekend. Best of luck with wrapping up your annotated bibliography, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Yeah.